Welcome friends to the second part of my series of lectures on acid-base homeostasis. In the previous lecture, we discussed about the various clinical presentations of acid-base disorders. I'd also gone on to discuss the various classifications of acid-base disorders. We discussed that they could be called either metabolic acidosis or metabolic alkalosis, respiratory acidosis or respiratory alkalosis. I'd say that metabolic alkalosis could be further classified as high anion gap acidosis or normal anion gap acidosis, which said that metabolic alkalosis could be classified as chloride responsive or chloride resistant alkalosis. Then we discussed about the respiratory acidosis and respiratory alkalosis, where I'd also highlighted that asthma presents both as respiratory alkalosis and respiratory acidosis. In case these concepts are not clear, I would request you to kindly go to my previous lecture and update yourself up with these informations. In the present lecture, we'll be discussing about the body's response to the change in pH. Whenever the pH changes either to the acidic side or the alkaline side, how does the body react to prevent this change? This is what I'll be discussing in the present lecture. Now, the body has its various levels of defenses, and the first level of defense is the buffer systems in the body. The kidney and the respiratory system also pitch in to play their role in trying to resist the change in the acid-base homeostasis. If a patient comes to you either in the emergency or in the ICU with an altered sensorium and a deranged arterial blood gas report, it is important to understand that all these mechanisms have already fired and have failed. And when you're treating a patient, should keep this in the background that lot of events have already occurred that hasn't responded very well, and then your management should be based beyond this. So let us discuss the various buffer systems which are present in the body to prevent the change in acid-base homeostasis. Now, what is a buffer? For a biochemist, a buffer is a mixture of a weak acid and the salt of its conjugate base. It's got an acidic component and it's got an alkaline component. So whenever a pH changes, if the pH from changes towards the acidic side, the alkaline component of the buffer, that is the salt of the conjugate base, will try to resist the change. If the pH goes alkaline, then the acidic component, that is the weak acid, will try to neutralize the change in the pH. So thus, whether the pH is becoming acidic or alkaline, this buffer will neutralize it and try to bring it to the optimum pH. The pK of a buffer is that pH at which the buffer works the best. There is an equation given by Henderson and Hasselbalch, which is the pH equal to pK plus log of bicarbonate into a constant into PCO2. The derivation of this equation, the clinical implication of this equation will be covered in a separate lecture. But there is a relationship between the existing pH, the pK of a buffer, the acidic and the anionic component of the buffer system. There's another word we're going to use. The word is called buffer value. Buffer value is the amount of acid or base required to change the pH by 1 unit. The optimal conditions for a buffer to work is that the pH which it is expected to buffer should be close to its pK. That's when the buffering potential of a buffer system is most optimal. And the ratio of the anionic component and the cationic component should be between a plus or minus, should be either 10:1 or 1:10. Within this range, the buffer exits its maximum buffering potential. Now, what are the buffer systems present in the body? The body has got 4 buffer systems: the bicarbonate buffer system, the protein buffer system, the hemoglobin buffer system, and the phosphate buffer system. The phosphate buffer system is very important for regulating the pH of the urine. We'll not be discussing that in detail in the present lecture. In the present lecture, I'll be discussing about the bicarbonate buffer, the protein buffer, and how hemoglobin exerts its potentials as a buffer. We'll also discuss about concepts of molecular intelligence. Now, let's get to the bicarbonate buffer system. This is by far the most important buffer system in the body. The general reaction is carbonic acid H2CO3 can dissociate to CO2 plus H2O, also can ionize to H plus and HCO3 minus. The concentration of CO2 and the bicarbonate in the body is in the ratio of 20:1. The pK of this buffer is 6.1. So if you remember my previous slide where I talked about what are optimal conditions of a buffer system to work, the pK is nowhere close to 7.35 to 7.45 where we want, and the ratio of the anionic and the cationic component is 20:1, which is way beyond the 10:1 which is required for optimal system. Biochemically, this may not be a good buffer, but in the human system, this is the most important buffer system. And why? Because we need to understand the concept of a closed system and an open system. Now, a test tube is a closed system. So, if the body were to be like a test tube where there are no reagents being added or changed, that's a closed system, then the bicarbonate buffer system in the body would have been an absolute failure. But we said that the bicarbonate buffer system has a CO2 and a HCO3 minus. The CO2 levels can be regulated by the lungs. Either you can breathe out the CO2 or you can retain the CO2. The bicarbonates can be regulated by the kidney. Either the bicarbonates can be retained or excreted. So now the human system is not exactly a closed system. It is a system where carbon dioxide can be added or lost, bicarbonates can be retained or lost. This is an open system. So the bicarbonate system as an open system with elements of lungs and kidney pitching in, regulating the pH, becomes the most important buffer systems. Now, how the lungs and how the kidneys regulate the pH will be a part of my next lecture. The next comes the protein buffer system. This constitutes 90% of the non-bicarbonate buffer systems of the body. Histidine, which is an amino acid present in proteins, is the one that contributes maximum to the buffering effect. Albumin has got 16 histidine residues in it and contributes to the maximum buffering potential of plasma proteins. We should remember that plasma proteins amount to about 6 to 8 grams per deciliter in the blood, making it a very useful non-bicarbonate buffer systems, always present in the blood. The third component that we need to understand is the hemoglobin buffer system. Hemoglobin as a protein can exert its buffering potential, but apart from that, there are other methods also where the hemoglobin exerts its buffering potential, and that is by the formation of carb amino hemoglobin, by the Bose and the Haldane's effect, and the isohydric and chloride shift. Now we need to understand all these components in greater details to really appreciate how hemoglobin works as a beautiful buffer system. But before understanding that, we need to understand the process of oxygenation and deoxygenation of hemoglobin. Now hemoglobin is present inside the RBC, and we all know that there are 4 heme packets sandwiched between the 2 alpha and the 2 beta chains of a hemoglobin. If we zoom further into the relationship between the globin chains and the heme, we find that this is the heme structure, which is planar. In the center is the iron, and this iron is in association with the amino acids of the beta globin chain, the proximal histidine and the distal histidine. These two are also exerting certain attractive forces to the iron present in the heme. Now, if you look at the molecule of heme and the iron is not in the plane of the heme, it is slightly below. When oxygenation occurs, the oxygen pulls a counter attractive force, and this iron, which is below the pyrrole ring, gets pulled up. There's a displacement about 0.4 angstrom units. Once again, the iron in the heme pyrrole is not in the plane but slightly below the plane. When oxygenation occurs, the oxygen molecule exerts a counter pull onto the iron and pulls the iron from below the plane to inside the plane, and that is a displacement about 0.4 angstrom units. Now remember, the iron is not getting oxidized. The iron is in the ferrous state stays in the ferrous state. It is just that the oxygen molecule is binding to the ferrous ion and pulling it into the plane, and this pull causes a displacement of approximately 0.4 angstrom units. Now, further zooming it down to the molecular level, this is the interaction of the amino acids in the deoxy stage. The moment the displacement occurs because of oxygenation, this bond is broken. There is a breakage of salt bridges, and when salt bridges break occurs, hydrogen ions are released out. So the process of oxygenation causes the displacement of the ion, causes the break in these salt bridges, causes the release of hydrogen ions. Now, one more thing that all of us have been taught is that oxygenation of the RBC exerts a concept of cooperativity. This is how the oxygenation of myoglobin occurs, which is an all or none kind of concept. Whereas if you look at hemoglobin, as the oxygenation starts increasing, the rate of oxygenation becomes progressively faster, and this is what we call cooperativity. Now, to understand the cooperativity, we need to once again revisit the structure of the hemoglobin molecule, and we know that it's made out of 2 alpha, 2 beta, and the heme pockets are sandwiched between them. All these chains are interconnected to each other. And now we have to understand the domino effect. When one oxygen molecule enters into a heme pocket, I said that there is a displacement of about 0.4 angstrom units. That is the whole basis of oxygenation and deoxygenation. Now, when there is a displacement of 0.4 angstrom units, I said that the chains get pulled. Not only the chain of the heme pocket gets pulled, it also exerts its traction on the adjacent heme pocket, displacing the ion further. It doesn't go all the way to the 4 angstrom units, may be displaced by about 0.5 to 1 angstrom units, but this displacement is significant enough to aid the entry of the second oxygen better. And when 2 hemes have got oxygenated, the total dragging effect on the subsequent heme pockets becomes more, and thus you will understand that with each addition of oxygen, the oxygenation of the remaining heme pockets become easier. That is this domino effect. Now, let us understand the terms Haldane's effect and Bohr's effect, the concept of formation and break of salt bridges. During the process of oxygenation, I said that there is a displacement of the ion, and this displacement exerts a traction on the globin chains, and there is break of bridges, salt bridges between amino acids, and this break of the salt bridges causes release of hydrogen ions. Oxygenation, salt bridges are broken, hydrogen, this is what I was talking about, the salt bridge, and this is the one which is broken, and when the salt bridges are broken, hydrogen ions are released. Now, when you talk to the Bohr's effect, during deoxygenation, salt bridges are formed, and because salt bridges are being formed, it requires hydrogen ions. Converse, if there is excess of hydrogen present in the hydrogen ions present in the ambient atmosphere, it induces the formation of salt bridges, and when salt bridges are formed, the binding of oxygen to heme becomes weak, and the oxygen gets liberated. Now, let's talk about another concept, isohydric and chloride shift. During metabolic processes in the TCA, carbon dioxide is produced. The carbon dioxide enters into the RBC. In the RBC, we have an enzyme carbonic anhydrase that helps the formation of H2CO3 and further dissociation of H plus and HCO3 minus. The H plus ions which are now being produced would be utilized for the formation of salt bridges, and when the salt bridges are being formed, I said oxygen gets released. The bicarbonate levels inside the RBCs increase. This bicarbonate is exchanged with chloride in the plasma. So, the plasma bicarbonate levels increase, the plasma chloride levels decrease, and the RBC intracellular chloride increases. So now here we are talking about hydrogen ions being produced by carbon dioxide not affecting the pH, that is isohydric, and chloride shift. The chloride being produced gets exchanged for bicarbonates. The extracellular bicarbonates increases, intracellular bicarbonate decreases, intracellular chloride increases. Now it is important to know that the bicarbonate also participates as a buffer system in the blood. Now let us look at the whole process from the body's point of view and appreciate molecular intelligence. In the peripheral tissue, metabolism is occurring. We know that in metabolic processes, a lot of acids are being produced. As a result, the pH is low. Also, all the oxygen is being consumed in the ETC channel for production of ATP. So the oxygen is being produced, and there is a requirement of oxygen from the peripheral cells. The hydrogen ions in the peripheral tissue get attached to the oxyhemoglobin, induces the formation of salt bridges, induces the release of oxygen to the peripheral tissue. Now peripheral tissue had excess of hydrogen ions, peripheral tissue was anoxic, club the two together, use the hydrogen ions to release oxygen, and when oxygen gets released, salt bridges are being formed, and for the formation of salt bridge you require the hydrogen ions. Use that hydrogen ions to form the salt bridges. So you are getting rid of the hydrogen ions without the change in pH, and you are also getting oxygen which you want in the peripheral tissue. 2,3-BPG molecule is a molecule produced in the Rappaport Lubberine shunt in hypoxic situations. This 2,3-BPG molecule has got a structure such that it can enter into the RBC, induce a conformational change, and this conformational change will induce in the release of oxygen from hemoglobin. So if there is a hypoxic state, how does the body assess the hypoxic state? By production of 2,3-BPG. The 2,3-BPG binds into the hemoglobin, induces release of oxygen. Release of oxygen requires salt bridges, so whatever acids are being formed in the metabolic processes are being utilized to form the salt bridges. So this is also a very required situation. So you get hydrogen ions, you lose hydrogen ions, and you get oxygen, and everything works in a well-oiled mechanism. The carbon dioxide produced in the TCA cycle can also directly bind to hemoglobin to form carb-amino hemoglobin. So that's another mechanism. Apart from the salt bridges which is mopping up the hydrogen ions, we are also forming carb-amino hemoglobin, where the carbon dioxide directly binds to the hemoglobin, forms carb-amino hemoglobin, and gets transferred without change in pH. I had discussed the isohydric and chloride shift. I said that the carbon dioxide gets converted to H plus and HCO3 minus. The H plus is used for formation of salt bridges. The bicarbonates within the RBCs get exchanged for chlorides in the extracellular fluid. Now, the bicarbonates which are being produced in the RBC is coming out of the RBC, it's coming into the plasma, where this bicarbonate can add up to the bicarbonate buffer systems. So the carbon dioxide which is being produced as an acid is being transferred in the blood as a bicarbonate ion which has potentials for buffering changes in the pH. Now what happens in the lungs? In the lungs there is excess oxygen in the atmosphere, and this oxygen induces the oxygenation of the hemoglobin. When hemoglobin gets oxygenated, salt bridges are broken. When salt bridges are broken, hydrogen ions are released. The hydrogen ions released bind to the bicarbonate to produce water and carbon dioxide, and this carbon dioxide gets exhaled into the lungs. So if you now look at the whole mechanism, the carbon dioxide which is being produced by the TCA cycle in the peripheral tissue gets transported to the lungs as bicarbonate ions, which is a very good buffer, and once it reaches the lungs, this bicarbonate now needs to be converted to carbon dioxide for being exhaled out, because the whole mechanism was transfer of carbon dioxide from peripheral tissue to the lung for exchange. Now, when I am doing this process, I am transporting it as bicarbonate, which is a buffer which I require. But once it reaches the lungs, how does it know that it has reached the lungs and that it needs to get lost into the atmosphere through the lungs? There the oxygen induces oxygenation of hemoglobin. Oxygenation of hemoglobin breaks salt bridges. Breaking of salt bridges releases the hydrogen ions. The hydrogen ions released bind to the bicarbonate to produce carbonic acid and carbon dioxide, and this carbon dioxide then comes out. Even when I am excreting an acid as carbon dioxide, I am first converting it to bicarbonate, using it as a buffer, and then reaching the lungs and then losing it off as carbon dioxide. That is the beauty of the body system, and that is the concept of molecular intelligence. The phosphate buffer, as I said, is not a very important buffer in the plasma regulation. It has an importance in regulating the urine pH. So, this is the whole concept of the buffer systems in the body. In the next lecture, I will be discussing the respiratory compensation and the renal compensation. I said that they also play a very important role in regulating the acid-base pH. In the renal compensation, we will talk about the sodium hydrogen anti-transport mechanisms. We'll talk about reclaiming of bicarbonates. We'll talk about production of ammonia. A lot of acids are excreted as such. Lots of volatile acids are excreted as such, like your ketone bodies. So together, both the respiratory compensation and the renal compensation add up to the buffering potential of the plasma buffers. And within this is an implication for management of patients. We'll discuss this in the next lecture. Thank you.